I appreciate you guys being with us again this morning. I appreciate your understanding of the administrator's time schedule today. He has got to be out of here on the stroke of 10, and he's very graciously agreed to take some Q&A after he speaks with us. And so what I'd like to do is give you a little brief introduction. I'll let him get right to it. Administrator Huerta has been, we've run across paths in D.C. quite a bit. The one funny story I'll tell you, June 5th, we were going into the White House through the security line, and I saw him, and I teased him that there was no pre-check for him. He was in the regular line with us. So we've known each other briefly, and we've passed through, and in D.C., he has very graciously agreed to be our keynote for our first annual conference, and I sincerely appreciate his time and his dedication to the aviation industry to come speak with us today. Most of you, I'm not going to waste time on bios. I'll let us get right to it, but let me bring him up here. I've got a few words to say, and I'll take him over. Ladies and gentlemen, FAA Administrator Michael Huerta. Thank you, sir. Thanks for coming. We really appreciate it, and I want to thank you for your service to the industry and to our country, and we look forward to having you again sometime. But thank you so much for coming today, and I'll let you have it.
Thanks much. Well, good morning. Morning. It's really great to be here, and it's a pleasure to join you for, I guess what John was telling me is going to be a first annual conference of independent pilots organizations. You know, I have the opportunity to speak to a lot of groups, and as the FAA's official ambassador for safety, I always enjoy visiting with a group of people that have your passion, the passion that you have each and every day, and that you come to work with that singular purpose. How do we ensure a system is safe? How do we ensure a system is efficient? And how do we ensure that we're doing the right thing for the traveling public? You know, it's also a particular honor to see so many people all in one place. I want to thank Captain Weeks and his staff for inviting me and for making this possible. But I did share with him that these days, getting out of Washington isn't really a bad thing. He asked me, how's it going? And I said, well, about how it looks. But seriously, I make quite a few visits to aviation facilities and to meet with aviation stakeholders all the time. One of the things that I do is everywhere I go, I like to take the opportunity to visit some of our air traffic facilities, some of our FSDOs, our CMOs, MIDOs, and interact with the people that are on the front line dealing with all of you. And if I'm in an air traffic facility, I like to listen in on the frequency. It is truly something impressive to watch, and I frankly marvel at the choreography that goes on each and every day at particularly busy airports. And even if they're busy, it's, pilots and air traffic controllers, I think I can say, certainly I know it's the case for our controllers. They have great admiration for the work that you do, and I think that feeling is reciprocated. There's also a very refined and somewhat warped sense of humor in those communications that take place between pilots and controllers. And one of my favorite stories is one that happened a number of years ago. It was before the last big round of airline consolidation, and an American Airlines flight crew right here at DFW called the tower to say that they were ready to taxi. Now, they happened to be next in line behind a Northwest Airlines jet, and that was back when Northwest was flying that red, gray, and white paint scheme. And so to make the instructions easier to understand, the controller said, American 1620, follow the Northwest DC-9 ahead of you to runway 18 left. Almost immediately, this indignant sounding voice came up on the frequency. DFW Tower, Northwest 2318 here. We're flying an MD-80. Thank you. I stand corrected, the controller replied. American 1620. See that plane in front of you? The red and gray one, the one that looks like a bowling shoe? Follow the bowling shoe to runway 18 left. Now, I'm sure you have all heard similar exchanges over the years and during your careers, and it certainly makes for good stories over dinner. But we all know that what we all have in common is a deep commitment to ensuring that the system is safe. And we also recognize how lucky we are to be involved with a mode of travel that still makes kids press their nose against the glass when they're at the airport waiting to go on a trip. Now, as I look out in the audience, I see a few of you who probably grew up as I did as children of the space age. It's hard for me to believe that it was 48 years ago that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin fulfilled President Kennedy's challenge to land on the moon and return safely to Earth. And to get there, the brightest minds of the world had to invent an entirely new science. They used everything they knew about mathematics and physics, and then they put it together in ways that had never really been imagined. Now, I think about this sometimes when I look at how far the commercial aviation industry has come during the last couple of decades. I'm sure that you all remember a time during the 1980s and the early 1990s when the headlines were dominated by news of aviation disasters. Think about it. Even today, many of us can list those accidents by memory, and they carry a lot of weight in our minds. They're a somber reminder of a time in aviation and of lessons that were learned at a very, very steep price. Many of you remember when we as a country set an incredibly ambitious goal, that we would reduce the commercial fatality risk rate by 80% over 10 years. That was in 1997. The year after 1996, which was, of course, one of the worst years we've ever had in commercial aviation. Now, the experts, the so-called experts at the time, were skeptical that it would succeed. Many of them laughed. But in 1998, we formed the Commercial Aviation Safety Team, which was the first real effort putting aside competitive agendas for the common good of the industry. And so, like those teams at NASA who invented the science of traveling outside the Earth's orbit, this industry got together and turned safety into a science. Now, we all know that during accident investigations, the ultimate goal is to find that one key piece of evidence. What is that one thing that tells us exactly what happened? But when it comes to safety analysis, what we've learned in the last 20 years is that key evidence actually turns out to be data, and a lot of data. Now, through the safety team, which we know as CAST, the industry and government began to share all kinds of data, looking for ways to identify and to mitigate the risk of accidents and incidents. And we wanted to use it to identify these risks and deal with them before it would result in a serious accident or incident. Now, this took a huge leap of faith. It was a leap of faith of the airlines, of the labor unions, and all of us in government who had to figure out how to set aside some mutually held suspicions about how this data would be used. What would happen if it was broadly shared across the industry? We didn't trust each other in 1998, so we did an interesting thing. We all understood a contract. And what we entered into was a contract that governed how this data would be used. Well, we began to share data from voluntary and safety reporting programs like ASAP and FOQA, as well as details about incidents that we might have experienced. And as a result, safety issues that would otherwise have gone unreported were brought to light. Fast forward 10 years, we had a goal to reduce the risk rate by 80%. By 2008, we did not reduce the fatality risk rate by 80%. We reduced it by 83%. And that was due to the voluntary adoption, and the emphasis is voluntary, the voluntary adoption of safety enhancements. Now, this did not capture the public's attention like the Apollo program did that we all grew up with. But during that 10-year period between 1998 and 2008, if you think about it, the commercial industry succeeded in a moonshot of our own. Because had we done nothing, we would be experiencing a single incident or accident every 2 weeks, just based on how the industry has grown since then. Now, as we all know, our work is never done. We can never stop looking at ways to make the system even safer than it is today, which is, of course, one of the most important reasons that we are all gathered here today. The question then becomes, how do we identify risk, and how do we drive it out of what is already the world's safest transportation mode? And how do we take something which is nearly perfect and make it even better? I think the answer lies in the same collaboration between government, industry, and labor that was responsible for establishing and sticking with CAST. Throughout the industry, we're enjoying a level of collaboration that we could only dream about back in 1987, or 1997. And the disciplines that are enshrined by CAST have led to an evolution throughout the industry. And this data-driven, this very open and transparent and continuous safety conversation has fundamentally reshaped the safety culture in the airline industry. Compare it to other industries. You know, last year we hosted a meeting at the FAA where we were asked by the head of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration if we could sit down and talk to the leadership of the car companies about what are the lessons we've learned in aviation about safety. So we put something together. We invited leadership from labor and from the aviation industry to come and share the story. There were 3 airline CEOs there, and every one of them, completely unprompted by us, began their presentation by saying, "We do not compete on safety. Period, full stop. We share information back and forth across the industry because it makes the industry better." That was kind of an aha moment. A very senior executive of a global car company stood up and said, "You know, we do. We have those NHTSA 5-star ratings that we all look for when we're buying a car, and maybe we need to rethink how we approach safety if we're ever going to get out from under the scourge of killing nearly 40,000 people on our country's highways each and every year." So I think we know that this approach works. And all of us, whether it's industry or government or our unions, understand that we have to achieve even deeper levels of trust and transparency if we're going to reach the next big goal that we've set for ourselves, which is to reduce the safety risk by another 50% by 2025. So today, airlines and operators all across the world have embraced the concept of robust safety management systems in figuring out how we identify and how we mitigate risk. And whether you're operating at an airline with a fleet of 600 aircraft or a Piper Cub out of a county airport, you can benefit from the principles of a safety management system that are tailored to the unique needs of the operation that you're involved in. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that our culture at the FAA is evolving. And during my tenure at the FAA, I've stressed the importance of doing everything that we can to become what I like to think of as a smarter regulator. An agency that moves closer to the speed of the industry we support as opposed to the speed of government. Now, a big part of that has been to adopt what we call risk-based decision-making. This approach enables us to better target our oversight of safety and of compliance. You know, a couple of years ago, even as airlines were adopting safety management systems, the FAA adopted a new compliance philosophy that drives our oversight of air carriers and other companies that we regulate, whether they're manufacturers, whether they're airports, and so forth. It was founded on the idea that we can get more rapid safety improvements in the system by working with industry to identify and to correct problems. And the goal is very simple. We want to mitigate risk, and we want to ensure positive and permanent change in the industry. The FAA is using our own data to target where safety risks and problems might emerge. And then we're focusing on addressing these precursors to a problem before they manifest themselves in an incident or an accident. And the philosophy is founded on the assumption that everybody in the industry wants aviation to be as safe as it possibly can be. And we're finding that the time spent to correct problems through, that word again, voluntary compliance, is much more effective when compared with the time that is spent on the more traditional enforcement activity. Now, just a few weeks ago, I signed an order that clears the way for the next step in the evaluation of our oversight. We recognize that just as we use data to drive how we achieve compliance, we also have to use the same data to drive our oversight if we want to be efficient and effective regulators. And this integrated oversight philosophy matures the industry. As it matures, what we will see is oversight based on higher risk operations or higher risk situations, which is a huge change for us because it means that we are not treating everyone the same. Instead, what we are doing is focusing on where we see the highest areas of risk. We want to foster a proactive approach to safety management that allows airlines and other participants in the system to disclose safety risks, to prevent regulatory noncompliance, and to ensure systemic fixes that work for the industry overall. And where appropriate, we will use compliance actions for correcting unintended regulatory noncompliance, but it doesn't mean we're walking away from enforcement. Instead, we're focusing our enforcement on activities where we have willful disregard for important safety regulations. Now, as with any change in approach, this transformation in how we do business takes time. We have to filter through our workforce because it is a pretty significant change in philosophy. But again, data supports that it works, that this approach means better safety, and that is why it must happen. Now, since we began our new compliance approach 2 years ago, the more open environment has resulted in even greater data sharing across the industry. According to our Aviation Safety Organization, this ongoing conversation identified more than 6,000 potential safety issues that have since been evaluated and mitigated over that 2-year period. Now, statistics like this are great when we're talking to a group of aviation professionals. But, you know, we all know that the average traveler doesn't really have a whole lot of interest and a whole lot of knowledge of what we're doing behind the scenes. Only that we are doing our jobs to make the next flight a safe one. You know, when I was growing up, I remember going to the airport, and there would be this little kiosk near the ticket counter where you could buy a life insurance policy for the flight you were about to get on. Cost about $5. When was the last time you saw one of those kiosks when you were going through the airport? So I think it's fair to say that we have put a business out of business, and that's a good thing. Because what passengers want is they want to board an airplane with minimal hassle. They want to cruise as safely, as uneventfully to their destinations. And maybe they're not thinking about whether it is safe, but it's because all of you are thinking about whether it's safe and how do we ensure that highest levels of safety. And we do that with amazing regularity. On any given day in America, some 2.5 million people are getting on airplanes, going to different destinations, some 30,000 flights a day across the United States. And a good day is when we have the same number of landings as we have takeoffs. Now, how we achieve all of this is not as important to them, those passengers, as the fact that they no longer have to worry about safety beyond the flight attendant's pre-flight briefing. Actually, we would like them more to listen to the flight attendant's pre-flight briefing. The mechanics of how we do our jobs day in and day out might not be that exciting, but I think the results are very much worth bold headlines at the top of any front page. Here in the United States, we have not experienced a fatality in commercial passenger operations since February of 2009, which is an amazing achievement. And I see someone knock on wood. This is because I think we all know that this safety record is only as good as each individual flight. Safety is intentional, and it requires a whole lot of dedication. And it demands that we're constantly challenging our conventional wisdom to look at everything we do, even though we might have looked at it 1,000 times already. Now, I'm encouraged that this type of safety risk analysis is beginning to take place at the airline level between some carriers and their certificate management offices. Delta Airlines and Alaska Airlines have both increased their collaboration with their CMO to include open sharing of data on safety issues as they have arisen. And it's an ongoing conversation in a non-punitive environment that is aimed at spotting trends, identifying issues, and dealing with them. And they are specific to a carrier and the way it operates a particular fleet of airplanes. The interaction is actually quite interesting to watch because you can see safety risk analysis as it plays itself out almost in real time. Now, ultimately, we would like to see this kind of relationship develop at all carriers in the industry. It is the next step on how we share and how we evaluate data. And I know that there are carriers and unions that are still struggling with how we make this work. How do we figure it out? And how can we build the mechanisms and tools to enable us to do it well? Even though we're 20 years into this, there are still questions that persist about exactly how far we can go in trusting one another to do the right thing with the data that we share. And that is something that we have to continue to work on. I'm here to tell you that this is something that we need to solve industry-wide, and I'm glad to see that this is one of the topics you spent some time talking about yesterday. For SMS or any other data sharing effort to work, we have to find a way to make sure that when weighing safety concerns against other factors, that safety always wins. Every time. We can't stand by and let a safety problem linger. We'll get to it later. We'll figure it out. We really need to focus on how we bring solutions to it, even if it might threaten the status quo. Now, the good news is we have a room full of smart people here who are passionate about aviation and who are very passionate about making it better. We know that passengers are flocking to the skies in record numbers because they know they know that you are going to do your job right every day and on every flight. And that's really something that all of you should be proud of, all of us should be proud of across the industry. But it's a big challenge. It means that we have to continue to look for ways to make the system better each and every day. You know, every day when I go to work in Washington, D.C., I feel honored to play a role in contributing to an aviation system that traces its roots back 114 years to that windswept hill in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And the progress that we have made since then is nothing short of amazing. And that is a great result of the work that you have all been doing each and every day. As we look toward that next 114 years of aviation, we know it is going to be very different. We know that we're going to have to continue to deal with questions like, how do we accommodate new users, unmanned aircraft? How do we accommodate commercial space operations, which we're now seeing every other week and are on trajectory to get to twice a week in the next couple of years? How do we accommodate the continuing desire to have access to our airspace, but respect the progress that we have made toward making it safe? I wish you all continued success, and thanks once again for your dedication to making this system the safest and the most efficient system in the world. You do a great job. Thanks for all you do. So questions? Sir, if you could introduce yourself.
And we're going to ask that we're live streaming, that you use the microphone, please, when you speak. So you'll pass it to the next person. That'll be great.
Administrator Huerta, thanks for coming, and clearly you share our wonderment and awe of this fantastic industry. Every one of us in this room that handles an aircraft is a direct employee of the airline that we fly for. You mentioned the word contract, and by definition, usually that's something that is written on paper and is clearly understood. But also, we understand inherently that as employees of a company, we could go, I work for American Airlines, I'm here with APA. I could go to Mr. Parker, and if there's a genuine safety issue, I can look him in the eye and say, you know, Mr. Parker, we need to address this issue without any concern for my future employment. Now, he might not like what I have to say, but there's no jeopardy because he, through safety management system, is directly responsible. But also, I understand that there is no punitive measure, no financial impediment to my future employment, and I can make my mortgage payments, I can send my kids on summer camps. My point is, atypical employment is starting to creep into our industry. And that's a very, very bad thing because it undermines this safety system that, as you clearly understand, has been built on the backs of those that have either made mistakes and put their hand up, owned them, and fixed them in partnership with the FAA. If I'm now an atypical or a contract pilot and I show up to an airplane and I got a mortgage payment coming or a kid's school fee to pay, and there's a little light on, now I'm the ultimate risk manager. Do I ignore it and go and know that I can make my payments, or do I say something and jeopardize that future employment security, which is what completely will undermine the work that you have accomplished to date? So I don't ask for a specific reply. I just want maybe you to think about that as a takeaway from this gathering. So thank you for what you do.
Let me just reflect a little bit on that. You know, I want to go back to the example that I used in talking about the car companies. I think one thing that we do have in aviation is this safety culture, which is very broadly based across the whole industry. And I certainly understand the concern that you have about raising problems and the non-punitive tools that we have put in place. And it's been a very hard slog to get there, to use those tools to build relationships of trust. And the question you're really asking is, can we depend on that trust to exist across the whole industry, where we don't have those direct relationships? And the question you're asking, I think, is a fair question. Does that culture that we have developed and invested in transcend the relationship that exists in any given contractual relationship between a company and its workforce? I think there are signs that it does exist. The question is it strong enough in order to enable us to be able to do the things that we do and that we know work? And it really then becomes, how do we sustain it and how do we grow it? We have to be thinking about, as you are, how the industry is evolving and what are the things that are happening that are challenging the status quo. And I think that what we all owe it to ourselves to do is to be thinking about, okay, how do these changes affect how we need to think about using these tools? It's a really good question, and it is something that we do have to give a lot of thought to. Thank you. What else? Okay. Over here.
Good morning.
Morning.
I have to admit that I'm not an American citizen. But I did
Where
want
are you
to. So I'm from Canada.
Yeah.
I'm a representative for the Air Canada Pilots Association.
Yeah.
I want to first off say that we always do look to the FAA as an example of a great regulator. Mm-hmm. How do you look at foreign regulators coming into your airspace, maybe using rules that are inferior? Thinking particularly about our own challenges with trying to reform and modernize fatigue rules for our pilots, flying specifically in the U.S. So if you can comment on that, and maybe share how you feel, or what keeps you up at night when you think about the airspace and people sharing that airspace in the U.S.
That's actually a really good question. You all know what the framework is. The framework, we work collaboratively through the International Civil Aviation Organization, and ICAO is instrumental in developing standards, best practices, and guidelines to member states in terms of how they should regulate their respective industries. Like any UN-based organization, though, ICAO also includes in its charter an opportunity for a carrier or for a country to take a difference. And we do it in the United States. There are things that we have filed a difference, that we choose to go a different path from where ICAO might go. Overall, what we're required to do under U.S. law, and it is unique and it's actually not really popular, is we are required on a regular basis to assess the capability of our counterpart in a foreign country to oversee and properly regulate their aviation industry. And that's the so-called IASA designations. And we, Category 1, Category 2, and we do those regularly. And we've had some very, very politically difficult decisions that we have made. When you put a country like Mexico in Category 2, or we put a country like Israel in Category 2, important allies in the United States, to the United States, but who nonetheless we believe that their regulator is deficient in meeting ICAO standards. And that is, the specific guidance we have from Congress. So we do look at that, and we have to go through our own risk assessment of how we have chosen to evaluate risk, and what does that look like in terms of the carrier's ability to oversee what's going on. I will say this. When we do deal with foreign states, and when we do identify problems, we typically see a really interesting thing, that the dynamic that emerges is it becomes the carrier community in that country that is pushing their regulator to be responsive to whatever it is that we might have identified. Most recently, we've seen that in India, but that was certainly the case in Mexico. That was certainly the case in Israel, and we've seen it even in places like Kenya, where Kenya would like to establish service to the United States, but they first have to pass muster. And we did find that our counterparts in Kenya as a regulator can properly oversee their air carrier, but now our colleagues at TSA are figuring out, can they provide the appropriate level of security? So it is something that we look at, which is different than saying it is all done the same. And that is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, analyzing data on, to constantly try to determine, just because something is the way it is today, should it always be that way in the future? And so as we've shared our experience in SMS with CAST and so forth, we're very active in ICAO. A big strategic initiative for us at the FAA is something we call global leadership. We feel that we have a responsibility to try to shape what the ICAO frameworks and guidelines are. It's a very slow process, and it is something that we have to work through. The current very controversial issue relates to lithium batteries and their proliferation throughout the system, and do they present a safety hazard? And countries are in really different places around that, and there's a confluence of and sometimes a conflict between what do we need to do on the security side versus what does that represent on the safety side. So it's an ongoing conversation that we have, but we are very active participants in it. And in fact, I would say in the last few years, we've greatly increased our participation and engagement in those international forums. Thank you. Over here. Okay. Behind you.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
My name's Dale Dixon. I represent the Southwest Airline Mechanics here in Dallas. My question is, when you talk about risk assessment and trends throughout the system with all the airlines, do you see any growing concerns regarding pressure on maintenance being able to meet timelines and mechanics, maybe not being as attentive as they should be?
Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that we are always concerned about how schedules and capabilities affect an ability of a carrier or an operator to continue to run a safe operation. And so, and that's a very dynamic thing. It changes with different times of the year. It's different at different hub facilities that a carrier might operate in. And so it is something that we pay attention to, and that's why the idea of the voluntary reporting becomes really important. What we're really looking at is, what is the data telling us? Where are we seeing instances of reports, and what can we identify as root causes? As you look broadly across the industry, are other carriers experiencing similar things? And what does that tell us about the unique culture or operating practice at Carrier A versus Carrier B? And so that's the kind of stuff that we're doing and we need to do more of on a consistent basis. Scheduling and the pressures associated with how we turn flights and everything that goes with that is always a factor that we have to be very vigilant and looking at. But I don't think we're necessarily discerning a trend that it is a growing area. We are seeing some surprising things, though, and that is, and there's a debate taking place across the industry of, we've deployed all kinds of technologies that are out there with the goal of enhancing and improving safety. And I think there's a very healthy debate that's taking place across the industry. Is that making us overly dependent on what the technology tells us as opposed to what does it tell us about the actual practice that is being followed. And that's one question. You know, we're not really, you know, this is, I'll use this example to make a point, not necessarily, you know, that this represents a broad trend. But you all remember the horrific Germanwings accident in France from not too long ago. And here we had a situation where a security practice that was adopted post 9/11 and was incorporated into aircraft, in effect the secured cockpit door, to keep bad guys out of the cockpit, became a principal barrier to letting the good guy in who would have saved that flight. And so, you know, we have to be thinking about, as the industry evolves, what are changes that are taking place and what do those risks look like? You know, as we were talking it through, and we weren't the overseer, it wasn't our aircraft, it wasn't our crew or any of those sorts of things, but we were very active participants in the investigation of that. And one of our senior executives in our aviation safety organization made this observation. We have introduced so much technology in aircraft. Are we now at a place where one of our biggest risk factors might be a rogue individual, an insider in the system that we need to figure out how we can get ahead of and how we can respond to? So, you know, that's the kind of analysis that we're constantly doing and that we need to do more of, and that we need to do much more broadly across the industry. And that's why every one of us has a responsibility to raise issues and talk them through, and we at the agency level, and I think the company level, and union leadership, all need to continue to build the collaborative frameworks and build the recognition that this is not only a good practice, this is an expected practice. The industry as a whole needs to never step away from this safety-first mentality. Let's put aside what might be individual corporate competitive factors. What we want to do is what's best for the industry overall, because that's what the flying public expects, and it transcends the borders of any one country. We need to work globally to continue to strengthen this safety culture. Thank you. Yes, sir. Another mic behind you.
Hi, good morning, sir. Brian Mandrigan from Allied Pilots. I wonder if you could spend a few minutes talking about privatization and modernization. You didn't think you were going to get out of here without answering.
I never do. Okay, we're having a big debate in this country about privatization. It's actually corporatization. The language in the proposed legislation would envision transferring management of air traffic control to a freestanding, non-governmental organization. And so the proponents are careful to say that is not necessarily privatization. I'll talk about where it stands, and then I'll talk about what I think are some of the issues that are yet to be resolved. The legislation which would corporatize, if you will, the air traffic operations of the United States is included in the Reauthorization Proposal of the FAA that was passed by the House of Representatives. The leadership of the committee hopes to take it to the House floor the first part of October. But, you know, you've seen the same reports that I've seen. Their whip count indicates that they're some 20, 30 votes short to get it to pass on the floor. There is a proposal that is floating around, and this happens in Congress, to attach to the FAA reauthorization a proposal that relates to meal and rest time for the trucking industry, which would address a lot of concern among the companies in the trucking industry about different regulations in different states. The trucking industry is largely regulated by the states. The aviation industry is, of course, all regulated at the federal level. But the belief is that provision could swing some no's to yes in the House because of states where there are large trucking industries who are extremely interested in this, in what they would view as fixing as a significant problem. So that's kind of what's the state of play in the House. Now, the problem with taking it in the first part of October is that is after September 30th when our current authorization runs out. And so there will have to be some sort of a short-term extension. Meanwhile, over in the Senate reauthorization proposal for the FAA does not include any construct of restructuring air traffic operations. The reason for that is the composition of the Senate Commerce Committee. It is largely rural states. The chairman is John Thune of South Dakota, and he's received a letter from every mayor in his state opposing this. The reason the rural states have expressed concern is it's an overall concern about access to air traffic services. And this is something that isn't being talked about, but the FAA actually has a twin responsibility. We have a responsibility to provide efficient and safe air traffic services for the vast majority of the users of the system, and we also have a responsibility to provide a basic level of service for the benefit of everyone. And so it is these rural, general aviation, business aviation constituencies that are really concerned about what does this mean over the long term. So it's not in the Senate bill. So I think there is some likelihood that it would pass the House. I don't see a path through the Senate at this point. And so that's going to set up a conference between the two houses where they're going to have to figure out how to reconcile the differences between the two. My biggest fear of all of this is it gets us to where we have unfortunately been many times before, and that is they can't agree, so we enter into a long period of short-term extensions of the overall authority of the FAA. I've been in the agency, almost 7.5 years, and in my tenure, we have had 25 or 26 short-term extensions. We have been shut down 2 or 3 times, and we have never started any fiscal year with an appropriation in place. Clearly, we can do better than this because it does make it hard to run the operation. But our political leadership is unable to reach agreement, and I think we could be headed for that. Most likely, the extension we will see pass the Congress will be a 6-month extension. The reason for that is anything less than 6 months means that the funding formulas for the airport improvement program do not work. And that is what members, particularly in the House, are most concerned about, the airport grant program. And so that will probably have a 6-month extension, which will kick it into the spring, and then there we'll need to have a continuing conversation. Here's what I think needs to happen. What I think needs to happen is I believe that there has been too much focus on the structure, and there has not been enough focus on what is the problem we're trying to solve. I think the problem that we're trying to solve is what I just touched on, the instability and the inconsistency of the authorizing and funding framework for the agency. And that's a much bigger question than just who sits on a board of directors. Think about it. We have, the aviation industry is supported largely through taxes and fees derived from the aviation industry. Airline ticket taxes, fuel taxes, overflight fees, registry fees, so on down the line. We have in the account that supports that a $6 billion surplus that we cannot access. And the reason we cannot access it is that $6 billion is used to offset deficits in the unified budget, the rest of the federal government. So a fair question I think the industry should ask is, what's the story with all this money? And why does the FAA which is supported by and large through user fees derived from industry, have to be subject to the budget caps of the rest of the government that are supported by general taxes? I think that's a fair question. We also have a significant cross-subsidy that exists across the air carrier industry and the general aviation community here. Those 30,000 daily operations that I talked about in controlled airspace, they're about half and half commercial and GA. And whether I am controlling a Cessna 172 or an Airbus 380, the cost to me is about the same to provide those air traffic services. But the lion's share of the cost is ticket taxes that are charged on airline passengers. And that's because we as a country decided many years ago that we wanted to ensure open access to the vast majority of users. And so the general aviation industry pays fuel taxes, but they do not come anywhere near covering the cost. And that's a decision that previous Congresses made. That's the kind of debate we need to be having. What are the services we want the FAA to provide, and what's the best way to pay for them? Now, out of that conversation, a structural conversation, may emerge. But I think that being singularly focused on the structure without talking about the larger things that we're trying to resolve as a result of that leads to a lot of people talking past each other. And personally, I think that's a big part of why we're stuck right now, because we're not having the conversation we need to be having, which is how do we move the ball forward? Now, the proponents of privatization, corporatization, whatever you want to call it, like to say that we have completely failed in the deployment of NextGen. Personally, I think that, I talked about all those extensions, stop and start funding and all of that. We have all new automation platforms that are en route systems. We have all new automation platforms in our terminal facilities. We have deployed performance-based navigation all around the country. We're working on getting the utilization up. We delivered Datacom in the terminal environment 2 years ahead of schedule. I actually think we're doing a pretty good job, given all this other stuff that has been thrown at us. And we need to stay the course, and we need to focus on that. Yes, there are things we want to fix. I mean, I'd like to get to that $6 billion and figure out how we can invest that for the benefit of the system. And so I think that, just one little closing factoid, I don't think that it's fair to argue that the industry and the agency have not done enough to deploy advanced technology in the cockpit to make the system operate more efficiently. And if that were true, then why am I getting bombarded daily with hundreds of complaints from citizens who complain that I've changed all the flight paths? It can't be both of those things. So clearly we're making a lot of progress there, and we really got to focus on how do we solve these larger problems that we're trying to solve as an industry. It's a great question. Thank you. Okay.
Good morning, sir. Harvey Meek, Allied Pilots Association. I'm on the Government Affairs Committee. And we think the First Officer Qualification ATP requirement was a good thing for safety. We're concerned about some political moves here recently. And can you comment on any pressure to roll back First Officer qualifications or make changes?
Well, there's certainly pressure. As you know, the ATP requirement was enacted by Congress following the Colgan crash. And it was enacted in the form of what would be a regulation that would take immediate effect on a defined date, and that what the agency was asked to do was promulgate a rulemaking of how we would allow credit to be applied toward the 1,500 hours, and we did that. What is at issue is many in the air carrier industry feel that we have not used that discretion enough. The agency currently, we don't have any plans to change anything that we did as a result of that rulemaking, and we believe pretty strongly that if Congress desires to change it, they have to give a specific direction to do that. Now, the Senate Reauthorization Proposal for the FAA does include, introduced by Senator Thune, language that would ask us to address that issue. And so there is a lot of discussion right now. I think the senator, the chairman is greatly concerned about trying to find what the right balance is. And John Thune is a good guy. He's not really, I think, looking to willfully create a safety problem. I think in his mind what he's thinking about is there another way to skin this cat and possibly to address some of the larger challenges there. Kind of comes back to what we talked about before. I don't see consensus developing across the industry. There's been a lot of discussion about availability of pilots, but many of you, many of your colleagues in other labor organizations have argued it's really about pay. There have also been a lot of conversations about how do we attract more people into the industry. I do know that there have been some conversations about, are pilots really a shortage? And should we maybe think of things in the educational sphere? Department of Education has provisions where they can forgive student loans and certain shortage provisions. And some in the industry, in the regional industry, are asking maybe we should think of pilots in that kind of capacity. The agency is not going to do anything without specific direction from Congress because we actually think that we've gotten a great safety benefit as a result of that. And I think it is factually incorrect for some in the industry to assert that this was an unintended consequence of Congress enacting that legislation following the Colgan crash. Congress was very clear. They wanted to raise the standard. And we believe we have done that, and we think the system is safe and better off as a result of that.
Good morning. My name is Richard Panicky. I represent the Atlas Air Teamsters, and my airline is an airline of 1,500 pilots. We fly under both sets of regs, the new passenger regs and the Part 121 regs. Mm-hmm. We have a fatigue management program in place. We also have very good software that's good at allocating pilots to fly to the absolute maximum human limits. Mm-hmm. We've written these reports. I speak for my colleagues when I say we're scared. Mm-hmm. With the amount of inexperience we're getting in the cockpits, things are not working out for us. It's like the writing is on the wall. We are wondering what is being done to make things safer for us.
For the cargo pilots.
Yes, that's correct.
So you're talking about Part 117.
And 121 mixed together.
Yeah. When we originally promulgated 117, the idea was, and our concept was, that it was going to apply across the full scope of the aviation industry, and that was the rule, as you know, that we put out for comment. We had a policy difference with our colleagues across the rest of the administration, specifically the Office of Management and Budget, which oversees the whole rulemaking agenda for the government, that they wanted us to demonstrate the cost-beneficial nature of the rule for every segment of the industry. And that's what resulted in what the so-called cargo carve-out when we were putting 117 together. As a policy matter, I think it was wrong because I do agree with I think the point that I've heard many of you make, which is it's all one sky, and everyone's flying in the same system, and that it is just incorrect to think that they're wholly different situations and wholly different challenges that are dealt with across the industry. Yes, there are differences between companies, but there are differences between companies that are covered entirely by one regulation or the other. And so I would like to see at some point a broader application of this to the full scope of pilots that are out there. But I think that it requires us to rethink how we look at cost-benefit analysis. The problem I have with, as a government, the way we do cost-benefit analysis for rulemaking is we look backwards. What we have to be able to demonstrate is that had the rule been in place, it would have prevented an accident or incident from happening. We don't have a lot of accidents and incidents, and I think that overall approach to rulemaking is fundamentally inconsistent with a proactive SMS-based approach where what you're trying to do is identify prospective risk in the system. Unfortunately, I don't have the only vote in that broader debate that we're having across the government. I think it is fair to say that, that people understand the argument that we're making. There are some passionate advocates for what you're trying to get there. I just encourage you to keep working on it. We're on a long road there. And fundamentally, we just need to recognize that the system will need to evolve to respond to the risk as we see it. Thank you. Get out of your way here.
Administrator Huerta, thank you so very
Thank
much
you.
for coming to see us, sir. It's been a pleasure. Everybody's been mentioning to me how appreciative they are that you came and that you're very honest and direct in answering the questions. And it was sincerely appreciated by us that you came to our first annual conference.
Well, thank you. Good luck.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for all you do. Okay.
Watch your step. I nearly face planted. Everyone, thank you very much. Once again, we appreciate all the work the FAA did and Administrator Huerta did to make it happen today. We're running a little ahead of schedule on the agenda. We didn't adjust it at the end, but what we're going to do is take 15 minutes. I tell you, I'll give you 20, and we'll be back right in here to start up with our last presentation of the day.